Welcome to lesson number 2 in our series on the parables of Jesus. Today we look at the parable of the Prodigal Son. If you're watching this in real time, it is still a balmy 15 degrees. I'm just recording them back to back and sending them out to you. If you hear some items in the background, some noise in the background, it's probably my dog that we've brought in because the weather is so cold. Normally a fully outside dog, but he is inside with us to help him out a little bit. And this lesson is a purely video lesson because it is the roads are too treacherous and walkways too icy for us to be able to meet. Down in the south, we don't do too well with this type of ice and snow. So if you're watching it from other places and it seems like kind of silly that we have to do this, I just tell people if you're not from the south, us dealing with snow down here is like folks in the north dealing with 110 degree heat index and 80% humidity for weeks on end as well. We all have our crosses to bear, don't we? Excited about looking at today is what I call one of my favorite parables. Just one note before we get into it. Whenever I move to a new church, this is the second sermon that I preach, and I preach it because of the message that it gets, which I'll go into more fully in just a moment. And that talks about that radical grace and mercy of God. So for me, this parable, as well as the first parable we covered on the Good Samaritan, on the great commandment to love God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. These are so foundational to, I believe, to our Christian faith and to how I try to look at and understand what God is calling me to do. When we look specifically at this parable, he tells this parable along with two others, back to back, in response to a serious charge leveled against him. And the charge is this fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. Now, this charge of associating with sinners was not just a criticism of Jesus, but it was a serious charge against his character, particularly since there were many people who were calling Jesus a rabbi. And they knew that any good Jew, much less a rabbi, knew not to associate with sinners, because it was an indication not only of their character, but seen as an indication of Jesus's character as well. In our understanding of things, in our Christian tradition, we say that all of us are sinners in need of the grace of God, redeemed by the grace of God through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. But in that day and time, the term sinner was more of a formal term for those who had been expelled from worship in the temple for a period of time, or maybe permanently, for this or that offense. And the law outlined what those offenses were and what the restitution was that was required to make the proper atonement for that particular sin. And so these were people who were outside the community of faith, and either temporarily while they were outside that community of faith before they had made penance, or permanently they were not to be associated with. And one way that I like to think about it in this day and time, when we think, well, Jesus was just where he needed to be with people who, as Jesus says at one time, it's not those who are well, it's not the healthy who need a hospital, but the sick. And we think, well, sure, that's how it ought to be. Jesus was right where he needed to be with those who were struggling. But I want you to think about it maybe in a little bit different way. If you were driving home one night and you saw your preacher's car parked at a juke joint, parked at a well-known bar, at a place where there was known to be a lot of drinking and carousing and other things going on, what would your first response be if you saw your preacher's car there, or even your preacher there? Would it be, I'm so glad that my preacher is out there witnessing to those lost souls right there where they are in their time of need? Or would the temptation to be to call the first person you can think of and ask them, can you believe? You won't believe where I saw the preacher's vehicle. I wonder what he's doing there. I bet it's not up to any good. I never would have guessed that he would have. And then we're off to the races. So in the midst of that. So we see in the midst of this that when they saw Jesus, they saw Jesus as maybe somehow being more like them and associating with them, and certainly not the type of character that they would have, the type of moral character and fiber that they would have expected in somebody who is a teacher, somebody who's a rabbi. And as usually happens, Jesus doesn't necessarily answer it directly. Instead, he tells three parables: the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the lost son, called the Prodigal Son. The parable of the Prodigal Son is the most developed of these three parables, and it is packed, I would say, with the most meaning. In fact, one person even called it the greatest short story ever written, because so much is packed into so few words. So let's hear this parable again, and I want you to listen closely and see if there's maybe something that you pick up that you haven't picked up before. Jesus said there was a man who had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the field to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am, dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He says, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you, and I've never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" One quick note on this parable is that just as with the parable of the Good Samaritan, when Jesus never used the word good, in some ways we have accepted what I consider to be a misnomer. And in a way, sometimes I think blunts the power of the message in this parable. By calling it the parable of the prodigal son. But notice that Jesus doesn't begin the parable by saying, "A young man had a father and an older brother." No, it begins by saying, "A man had two sons." And as we'll see, it's the father who is most central to the story than the son who either goes away or the son who stays home. So let's give a quick recap. The son tells his father he wants his share of the money. That part is not unusual in the sense that if there were two sons, the older son would receive 2/3, the younger son would receive 1/3. So it's not unusual in one sense that he would receive an inheritance from his father. What is unusual is that he comes while his father is still living, and he asks for his inheritance. So it's a way of saying, "Father, I want what is coming to me. I want what is mine, would be mine upon your death. And essentially he's saying, Father, I wish you were dead. I want nothing to do with you or this family anymore. You just give me what rightfully belongs to me, and I will be on my way. Almost 30 years ago now, there was a biblical archaeologist by the name of Charles Page who was doing what we used to call a lay academy at Tupelo First United Methodist Church when I was an associate pastor there. And he was talking about this story, and one of the things that Dr. Page used to do would be he would spend time over in that part of the world, not only looking at archaeological sites, but he'd also travel with some of these Bedouin nomads. He said that they lived in a culture in a way that's most similar in our day and time to how they lived back then, even though a lot of these nomadic people still have a lot of modern amenities. But they live the most similar in how they do that, especially in those times of the year where they are living that nomadic lifestyle. He said at night they would sit around and they would tell stories. And one night, Charles Page was asked to share a story. So he decides to tell this story of the prodigal son. And as he gets started, he gets in and is barely into the story when the head of the group said, "Stop, that story makes no sense." And Charles Page says, "Why doesn't the story make sense?" And he said, "It would be unheard of for a son to so dishonor his father in that way." Well, that got Charles Page's interest up, and he asked the follow-up question, what would you do if your son came to you and did to you what this younger son did to his father in the parable, in the story? And the man said, honor would demand that I kill him. That's how serious it was. He is breaking ties completely with his family, saying to his father, I want nothing more to do with you. I wish you were dead. You are dead to me. And if that wasn't bad enough, he then says he takes his money and he goes to a far country. A far country was a euphemism for a Gentile country. And he spends all that he has in dissolute living. And so he's abandoned his family, and now he has abandoned his faith by going to a Gentile country and engaging all the things that are going on there. And if that weren't low enough already, he wastes everything, he loses everything, a famine comes, and he's reduced now to feeding pigs. And if there's anything that we know, we know the feelings in Judaism about pigs and about pork. And he is now feeding the pigs, not able to eat anything. He says he's literally starving because the pigs are eating better than he is. And so the young man, it says, comes to himself. I love that. I love that statement. He came to himself. And he says, even hired hands at my father's house live better than I do. Basically, he says, what I've done is so great, I can't go back as a son, but maybe I can go back and at least have some food. Now, again, as Jesus told parables, oftentimes he took what were familiar tropes, what were familiar kind of parables or setups of the story, and the story would go a particular way. And if Jesus had been telling this parable and he said that he runs up to the father sees him, the father turns and goes inside, then it would have been understood as a parable that you can never dishonor your parents like that. He broke that commandment. He got what was coming to him. He could have said in the parable, well, the father takes the son back as a hired hand, demonstrating that the father has compassion, but there's still penalty for sin. Either one of those would have been seen and would have been right in the norm of what goes on. But notice that Jesus doesn't do either of those things. In fact, he goes way opposite of that. The reaction of the father is joy. And the joy is not only that he sees him, that he runs to him and he embraces him. And far from not accepting him or forcing him to take a subordinate role, he puts on him, he orders the ring and the sandals and the fatted calf. The ring was like a signet ring. It restored him to access to the family funds. The sandals meant he was family. The slaves, the servants didn't wear sandals. The fatted calf was something that was sacrificed only, that was killed only in the times of great joy and great celebration. Because this one who was lost in every way, who'd rejected his faith, who'd rejected his family, who was down to the point of starvation, this one who was dead in so many ways, came to himself, and he was restored to life. He was lost and had been found. One of my favorite passages where it says he came to himself, because it's a reminder, you see, that state of separation of us from God is not who we truly are. It's not who we are truly made to be. It is not, we aren't truly ourselves when we're apart from God. When he comes to himself, he realizes what he has lost. It is only when we submit ourselves to God and follow his will and experience the freedom that comes from following him that we are truly freed up to be our fullest and our best selves, to be the people that God has created us to be, to have that image of God restored in us. And all is forgiven. There's great celebration. There's great joy. And if the parable ended right there, boy, what a high point. It might be still difficult for people to accept, but what a great way to end the story. Except we still have this tricky matter of the elder brother. I think Jesus was using the son to speak to those who had gone off to their own far country. And now he uses the elder brother to speak, I believe, to those Pharisees and scribes who made that original charge. This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. The elder brother is aggrieved. He's upset. He's angry. He's livid. After all, he's done everything. He's done everything he's been asked to do. He stayed home. He's obeyed his father. He's never got in trouble. And instead of being appreciated for his faithfulness, the younger son seems to be one who gets rewarded, even though he has gone and done everything. And notice that in this he says, when this son of yours, when he's angry and he's talking to the father, he doesn't say this brother of mine. He says this son of yours. In other words, this man is no longer my brother. You may consider him your son, but he's not my brother anymore. And you seem to be rewarding him for all that he has done. Not only does he get away with it, he is celebrated for it. And truth be told, this part of the parable can be tough to hear sometimes, especially for those of us who, for the most part, stayed home, who have tried to do what is right, who didn't go off and sow those wild oats, who try to do what is expected in the midst of that. I will say that I make mention at the beginning that it's my favorite parable, and I use it as the second sermon in a new church I go to. I always have people who say, I don't like this parable at all. And it's because they feel like the younger son gets away with something. And we're going to talk about that as well. Because you see, when we have that attitude, we often don't admit it or recognize it, but there's actually a little bit of envy that is there. As if that person went off and had all that fun that I didn't get to have. And boy, I wish I could get away with it. The elder brother hasn't laid eyes on his younger brother. He doesn't know that he's at the point of starvation, and yet he presumes to know what the son has done. He presumes to know, and just to think that he just came back willy-nilly. Ellsworth Cowless, who was a longtime professor of biblical studies and a preaching professor, once wrote a study called Parables from the Backside, and it's an interesting way. I'd recommend it to you. And in that parable, in his accounting of this parable, he writes the following words about the older brother. He probably said to himself, even before his younger brother's return, I know what he's doing there in that city. He's spending his time with those beautiful, wicked women, that rotten dog, then under his breath, that lucky dog. That's kind of how we are when we say, oh, he's just getting away with it. That's the older brother's attitude. He's gotten away with something. Something I wish that I could get away with, or I had the guts to try to go and get away with. But what the older brother doesn't seem to understand, and what the Pharisees didn't seem to understand, and what we sometimes don't seem to understand, is that what happened, what the younger brother did and what happened to him wasn't freedom. It wasn't glorious. Rather, these things, under the guise of freedom and lack of boundaries, entrapped him and enslaved him. And by the time he figured it out, it was too late. He was down there in the pit, literally there in the mire and muck of the pigs. And it doesn't mean he wasn't responsible for what he did, but at the same time, he wasn't off having a fine old time and then returning in triumph to show how good he had it. He had a short-term indulgence that had long-term consequences, followed even by starvation. And whatever fun he thought he was having at the front end of things, it clearly demonstrated that he was now trapped and without any options apart from the compassion and the forgiveness of his father. I think we, along with the Pharisees, fall into this trap. That those who were those sinners and tax collectors were just off having a fine old time, indulging themselves in all those different vices, those vices that are real or imagined. But Jesus was reminding the Pharisees, and I think he reminds us today, that those whom he was associating with, who were in their own far country, were alienated from the community of faith. Many of them were alienated from their physical families. They were alienated from their spiritual families. They were alienated from everything that was foundational and ultimately meaningful in life. They needed to hear that word of grace. They needed to hear that word of hope and to know that there was mercy available, to know that there was an out, to know that there was an option as they came to understand the state that they were in, to know that there was a possibility for something different. Over the years, I've had people who have come by my office. Sometimes they're members of the church, but other times they've literally just been driving by and they were in such a state that they saw a church, thought there might be a preacher there, and stopped to want to talk, who had messed up, who had done things and really messed up in this life, and wondered if forgiveness was possible. They had alienated themselves from relationships. They felt alienated from God and these things that they were doing, and they would say to me, "But Chris, God knows what I have done. How can he forgive me?" They knew that there was something within them that was bringing them to come see me, or bringing them to stop, or bringing them to look. But they were afraid that they would be rejected. And they were afraid that they'd be rejected by their family, or maybe by their preacher, or by their church, but ultimately be rejected by God. So Jesus was offering then, as he offers now, a different way. A way of mercy, a way of compassion, a way of love, a way of forgiveness that restores us when we come to ourselves, that restores us to that relationship with God. I love the response of the father to his elder brother. He says, we had to celebrate. He says, son, all that is mine is yours. It always has been. In other words, son, the problem isn't that I didn't offer it to you. The problem was you didn't ask. And if you had asked, I would have gladly given whatever you wanted, Lord, given to you. All that is mine is yours. You're a part of me just as much as your younger brother is. And he says, but your younger brother, he doesn't say my son, he says your younger brother. He's lost and is found. He was dead and is alive again. We had to celebrate. We had to rejoice. It's imperative not to force him to suffer more, but rather to rejoice that he is now restored, and to rejoice at that new life that he has. And he leaves the parable, Jesus leaves this parable open-ended. Have you ever noticed that we never get a final response of the brother? We don't even know if the brother ever went in after this or the brother stomped off. And I think Jesus leaves the parable open-ended on purpose. I think he leaves it open-ended as a way of inviting the Pharisees and the other religious authorities of the day and their family members of those who were alienated, who were prodigals in their day and time. Inviting them and inviting us to decide whether we are going to be like the elder brother or whether we're going to have the compassion and mercy and joy of the loving Father. Whether we're going to be like those who demand extra payment and restitution, or whether we're going to be those that recognize that those who have been in their own far country in whatever way, whether they physically traveled there or not, to offer them the freedom, to offer them the joy and the restoration of home. As we look at this parable, we have a choice as to whether or not we get upset at or whether we rejoice with that person who has been lost, for whatever reason, who is now found again. Whether we get upset at or whether we rejoice with that person who is dead in sin but has been restored by Christ to life. Through this parable and through the accompanying parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin, Jesus invites us to value mercy over judgment, celebration over condemnation, and to have the same kind of joy that God has when one who has been lost, one who has gone off to their own far country, returns home into his arms of embrace. My preaching professor, Dr. Fred Craddock, once put it this way. He said what is central in these two parables, as well as the third parable of the prodigal son, is the joy of finding. A joy so abundant that it calls on others to share in it, and such as heaven's joy at the coming of sinners. And Jesus calls upon his critics to join him and to join heaven in celebrating the presence of tax collectors and sinners. That joy expressed in this last parable as a party for the prodigal is not only the heart of the gospel, it's also its offense. After all, does not forgiveness look very much like condoning when viewed from a distance? You see, that's it. We can look at something from a distance, or we can look at it up close. We can see it as the world sees it, as our legalistic framework wants to see it, or we can look at others as God sees them. And we can welcome them, that prodigal who comes home. You see, in the end, the grace and the mercy of God is available to both the prodigal and the older brother, both who, by the way, are lost in different ways, both who need to repent of actions or attitudes of heart, and both whose hope for that mercy and hope for that full and abundant life, for that loving joy, both the hope that both have, that relies in the forgiveness and the love of the Father. That was their hope then. It is our hope today. May we be open to experiencing the loving mercy of God the Father, and may we be open to rejoicing when those who are those prodigals, those who have gone away to their own far country, return home. Let's throw a party today. Thank you for joining me today. Our next lesson number 3, will be on the parable of the unforgiving servant that is found in Matthew 18, verses 21 to 35. How much do we really believe, then, in the continuing mercy and grace of God? Thank you for joining me today. Have a great day. God bless you.